Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/save. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
Hello and welcome to Audiobook Connection, behind the scenes with the creative teams. I'm Becky Parker Geist, and I'm your host. Audiobook Connection is your place to learn about the audiobook creative process in discussions between the authors, narrators, producers, and post-production teams that bring them all together, as well as guests who have listened to the audiobooks and have questions for the creative teams. This podcast is sponsored by Pro Audio Voices, helping great stories come alive through audiobook production and marketing. Hi, I'm Becky Parker Geist, and I'm the CEO of Pro Audio Voices and also the president of Bay Area Independent Publishers Association. And I have the delight and honor to have with me today Laura Davis. Laura is the author of The Burning Light of Two Stars, a mother-daughter story, which we will mostly focus on in this interview. She's also the author of The Courage to Heal, as well as 5 other best-selling nonfiction books. Laura, thank you so much for taking the time to be with me today.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Glad to be here.
So let's jump right in. Laura, you narrated your own audiobook edition of The Burning Light of Two Stars, a memoir. And I would love for you to tell me a little bit about what that experience of narrating your own audiobook, what that was like for you as the author.
Well, I wasn't sure at first if I was going to do it because I didn't know if my voice would be appropriate or if it would be the best choice for the book and for the listeners. I did have a background in radio. When I was in my 20s, I worked as a news reporter, a radio news reporter, and then a talk show host in Ketchikan, Alaska. And so I did have some training in using my voice, and I love radio, I love podcasts, I love interviewing people, and I love being interviewed. And so I was pretty comfortable with audio as a medium, but I still didn't know if I could really pull off recording my own story. So actually, Becky, what I did was I made you a little audition tape, and I just recorded, I think, the first couple short chapters and sent it to you and kind of waited with bated breath about what is she going to say. And you said something like, "Oh, you're one of the most talented amateurs we've ever had," something like that. And you said, "You absolutely can do this." And that was exciting to me because I know I like hearing a book in the voice of the author. I think it adds so much to hear the author tell it, especially a memoir. I mean, I have recorded a couple of books before, nonfiction books.
Yeah.
But recording a memoir was very, very different. And the concept I had was that I knew, the main 2 characters in this book are me and my mother. And my mother was an incredibly dramatic, intense, charismatic character. And I didn't think I could do justice to her voice. And the book happens to have a ton of dialogue. I mean, it's like scene after scene after scene. And I didn't think I could play all the characters. So my idea was that I would be the narrator of the book, telling the story, and then I would do my own voice. And then I asked you to voice all the other characters. And that's what we ended up doing. That was my concept. And I'm really happy with it. I mean, it was really fun having you to play off of as we did these scenes. I both enjoyed the process and found it quite stressful. Part of the stress was just getting the tech together. I mean, right now as we record this, I'm standing in this closet in my office, this like closet that has no insulation, no doors, and it's got these like black blankets I bought on the internet that are soundproofing blankets, and I'm standing on this like foam interlocking stuff like they have in playgrounds, all to help muffle the sound. Mm-hmm. And then I had to learn how to use Audacity. And I mean, it was a lot. It was a huge amount of stress, really.
Yeah.
But I'm actually really happy we did it.
Yeah. Yes, as am I. And so Yeah, there is. I think, I do remember that moment when you sent the audition for your recording your own audiobook. And, for many authors that come to us with the idea of recording it themselves, it's not the best fit for their book. Not because they're in any kind of disconnect with their book, but simply the lack of experience with, or more specifically, with having developed those particular skills, which you had already spent some time in your career developing. So that was exciting.
One of the things I enjoyed the most about recording an audiobook is I felt like it made me more intimate with my story than anything I had done before. And I mean, you think, when I think about any chapter in that book, any scene, I would say I absolutely, this is not an exaggeration, rewrote every scene, every paragraph, every sentence at least 100 times, probably much more. So I knew the book inside and out. I mean, I created it draft after draft after draft after draft, but there was something about saying it out loud that created this relationship to the material that was very emotional for me, because by the time you finish writing a book, you're even though people might say, "Oh my God, you revealed so much. I can't believe how brave you are. You're so courageous. I can't believe you told that story or you admitted that." It doesn't feel that way to me, because to me it feels like I'm telling a story. And I'm not really sharing the raw edge of my life today. I'm reporting on or reenacting the raw edge of my life, 10 years ago or 20 years ago, or this book spans 57 years. So, I mean, I'm recreating things that happened a long time ago that have long since been integrated. And so it's a way I feel more like a storyteller than like I'm confessing something.
Yeah.
It's become polished. It's become shaped into a story. And the story has changed for the benefit of the story. I mean, what I left in, what I took out, certain things I accentuated, certain things I de-accentuated, which every memoir writer has to make those choices. But when I read it out loud, I felt it.
Yeah.
I really felt it again, and it was powerful. It was a good experience. I also found mistakes after this book was edited over and over and over again. I found little mistakes that I just couldn't believe went through all those passes.
Right.
And we're still there. So it's really a great way to edit your book.
Yeah, indeed. I love what you were saying about how intimate the recording experience is. I know that some people, if they imagine what it might be like being in a small booth with just a microphone, it may not feel, intimate in that it's small, but intimate in terms of the material and the relationship with the listener. That's a really interesting point. Did you have any expectation or about that part of the experience?
I didn't know what it would be like, and I had a lot of anxiety about my performance, how it was going to sound. And because I was recording with you and you're a professional at doing this, your performances, your recordings were very consistent. Every time we recorded, even if you hadn't gotten enough sleep, you just woken up, you sounded the same in a positive way.
Yeah.
There was a steadiness. And for me, I had some days I felt like I was really on. Like I felt the story. I felt like my voice I felt like I was whispering into the ear of the listener, and I was telling a story. And other days I felt like I was reading, and there was like a stiffness or a formality or the accent would be in the wrong place. And so it was harder to be consistent for me. And so, some of the most egregious places I redid.
Yeah.
And it's going to be interesting. I still haven't heard the whole thing. And actually, the time we're recording this interview, I'm about to get to hear the full audiobook edited.
Yeah.
And completed. And I think that's going to be a really interesting experience to just sit back and listen and see if I can feel as if I'm hearing a story. I think one of the things that I want to say, I haven't said this anywhere, but I'm going to say it right now, is that the thing in some ways I care the most about with this story is, I've been a writing teacher for 25 years. This is my 7th book. And I worked so hard on the craft of this story. Like I had to raise the level of what I was capable of in terms of storytelling. I had to learn a lot more about creating an arc for me as a character. I had to learn how to write a really vivid, compelling, multi-layered scene where the reader or the listener wouldn't know what direction things were going to go in, and there'd be this suspense that would be built up. And I loved learning those things, but they were hard to learn. And I think more than anything, that's what I want people to say when they finish this book is, that book was really well written. I want them to say it was a good story, or it inspired them, or it moved them, or they cried, they laughed. But what I would really love for them to say is, that was a damn good story.
So you talked a little bit about this, what it was like in terms of the intimacy of that storytelling for you. Now, this is a very personal story, and it's got some very challenging experiences that you lived through. And I'm wondering if you can talk to us about how it felt to read those scenes aloud, to bring that material to life in this very intimate context.
I think when I think about some of the most revealing scenes, and I can remember when the first draft, where I was just getting the raw material out, and often I would just be sobbing my heart out as I wrote because I was right in the material. But then, you work it over and you work it over. And I wrote this book over 10 years. So over the course of 10 years, the emotions became secondary to how to tell the story because I wanted the reader to have feelings. I didn't want to just report on mine. And so I got more focused on the craft of how to do that than feeling my own feelings anymore. I mean, I had already processed them. I mean, I had already integrated these experiences. But there was something about reading them out loud. In order to do the story justice, I had to allow myself to drop back in to that younger self and feel that vulnerability, that fear, or that terrible hopefulness that I know now was never going to be met. And there were times I really felt that emotion. I really felt those feelings again. And it's like doing this life review, really. Even though this is a very narrow swath of my life, someone reading it is going to think, oh, this is your story. Well, it's one of many stories about my life. This is just one.
Yeah.
I had an interesting experience yesterday. I was talking to, actually, my cousin, and we were sitting on a bench by the ocean, and she was asking me, why did I feel like I had to keep... She didn't put it in these words, but the message was, why do you keep having to rehash the same material over and over again? About the trauma in your childhood and the challenging relationship you had with your mother and your estrangement and your reconciliation and healing. And I could tell that she was sick of it. As a family member, it's like, okay, Laura, you've already done that. Why are you doing it again? Because it's so different. And I think we have these core stories that are ours to live with, are ours to sort out, are ours to tell. And this is one of mine. And I expect that I will continue to have a different relationship to this material until the day I die. And if I was going to write this book 10 years from now, I would probably tell it quite differently. So, I think it's an interesting path. And certainly I have so much more insight into this story and the characters than I did, 35 years ago. I first was writing about some of this material, and I have so much more, my heart is more open. I have more compassion. I have more understanding of everyone, and not just their behavior in the moment, but like, what are the forces that shaped everyone in this story that made them behave the way they did? And so I think that compassion comes through. That was very important for me. I didn't want there to be any villains in this story.
Yeah.
I wanted to be as human and flawed as, my mother, who was the other main character, who was definitely human and flawed. I wanted the reader to feel, or the listener to feel, empathy for both characters, both of these two kind of powerhouse, very strong women. I wanted people sometimes to be relating to me and sometimes grimacing at what she was doing, sometimes grimacing at what I was doing.
Yeah. And I think you pulled that off. So Well done. I think it's a beautifully written story. Let's pause for a moment. We'll be right back. There is nothing like a great book to transport you to new worlds. Here at Pro Audio Voices, we love working on projects that transport the listener. We pay attention to the details, like making sure we have actors that can clearly differentiate the character voices, making for a great listening experience. If you have a book that you would like to get into audio, and you're looking for a team with a personalized approach, Pro Audio Voices might be just the right fit. Come visit us at proaudiovoices.com. I want to dive a little deeper into those scenes between Temi, your mom, one of the roles that I was playing, and yourself, and some of those dialogue scenes. And, I'm curious if you could speak even more to what that felt like, because in a dialogue section, it's even a little different from the storytelling narrative, right? It's requiring that we step into being in that moment again. Did that feel like what you experienced in terms of, when we were in, whether it was having a fight or having a conversation, what was that like for you?
There were a lot of fights. It varied from time to time, but it felt like I had really nailed her voice. Like when you would respond, it would be like, yeah, she would have said that. That's just how she would have, what she would have said and how she would have responded. And it didn't, I felt like what I was hearing in my head from the actual experience did not always match what we were able to perform or do. And of course, you didn't sound anything like Temi. And you didn't sound anything like my children you didn't sound like my children. You didn't sound like my spouse. And so it took a while for me to get over that, that you didn't have the vocal qualities they had. But, for most listeners, that's not going to matter. For this audience of me, it was like, that was awkward, but I got used to it. And when I was able to listen back, I was able to step back and just take it in as a story. And I personally think that listening to a story is such an intimate way to take in a story. There's something so encompassing about listening as opposed to reading. And, these days when I read, usually in 3 paragraphs I've fallen asleep. So I'm not doing very well with reading books these days. But listening to stories, that's really, I do it when I'm walking or doing the dishes or just sitting. I really, really like that. It feels like I'm entering that world. And it was very gratifying to create a world that people could enter into.
Did you find at any moments that you, as listener, whether it was like during the recording or listening back to it, when you felt yourself like you were leaning towards the sympathy with one side or the other side of the conversation rather than your own? Did you ever have that experience?
Yeah, there were a couple moments where I did some truly cringeworthy things towards my mother. The one that stands out to me the most is when I was in a cult as a teenager, and I wrote my mother a letter that basically said, you are not my real mother. You are just my earthly parent. So, when I read that, it was like, oh, man. Because, I've raised children, and I'm a mother. I'm a grandmother now, and I just think, oh, my God. I was so difficult, So, yeah, I was able to have more empathy for her at that moment than for myself.
So, for your listeners, what do you have an intention around what you would like for your listeners to experience in terms of whether it's results or is it just the storytelling experience? Do you have any intentions around what you want them to experience as your listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm a teacher. I've been a teacher my whole life and I've been a communicator my whole life, whether I was doing radio or blogging or writing a column or writing books or interviewing people. It's all been about communication, and it's definitely in my teaching too. I'm not just teaching the craft of writing. I'm teaching writing as a tool for transformation. And so I hope that this story will open people's hearts. One of my early readers said, I finished reading Laura's book and I picked up the phone and I called my mother for the first time in 18 years. So, I'm not saying, and that's not necessarily right for everyone. I don't at all want anyone to think that I'm advocating reconciliation or reaching out in all cases. There are times when the person you're dealing with is so toxic and damaging that creating a boundary and keeping it is absolutely the wisest choice. So I'm not all in on reconciliation by any means, but I hope people would walk away from this story realizing that there is so much more possible than we believe is possible in human relationships. And that if you really, really are committed, it is possible to change a situation that seems utterly intractable and impossible. That's what my mother and I did. We changed a situation. Not everyone can do it, but even if we hadn't done it together, I believe I could have still come to a place of real peace and resolution, even if she didn't come along.
So you mentioned both in your book, it comes up, but also, just now you were talking about as a teacher of transformational writing or writing as transformational tool. Could you tell us a little bit more about what kinds of, what your work is in that arena?
I think that writing is an incredibly powerful tool. I mean, all the arts are, but writing is the one I know the most. And that if you really practice, and it is a practice, just like yoga is a practice or meditation is a practice. Writing, too, is a practice. And if you write in an environment that is safe, and that I think that's a lot of what I do, is I create an environment where people feel safe accessing and expressing some of their deepest thoughts and feelings. I've seen many times people write something in a writing group that they would never reveal to anyone anywhere else. And I know for me the same is true. I often will share something in a writing group that maybe I'm not even ready to talk to my spouse about or my best friend. It can be the very first place that I dare to express a thought or a wish or a desire or some kind of deep knowing arises to the surface. And so I like to foster an environment where people can do that level of work. And, I work with a lot of people who consider themselves writers and they're working on, a memoir or a novel, and I'm helping them with the craft of writing. And I like to do that. But what I really love to do is this other work of creating communities of people who become very, very connected through words and sharing life stories. I think there's such power in sharing our stories. And when we hold something and it festers inside of us, it can be so damaging in our lives. And when we let it out, and when you write it first, and then when you dare to speak it out loud and it's witnessed by a compassionate listener who is not judging it, who's not evaluating it, who's not critiquing it, who's not saying, you can't say that about mom, or I don't remember it that way. It really is transformative. And I love seeing that happen. And it's really a great way to deal with stress. It's a great way to deal with trauma. It's a great way to deal with change. When you're in a time of transition and you're between two phases of your life and you don't know where you're going, writing is a great way to begin that exploration. So, and sometimes it's an incredible way to celebrate. So I just am all in with the power of words. And that's what I've been doing in my career, is creating communities and environments where people feel safe and get to celebrate language together.
That's beautiful. Now, I know that you have been very fully immersed in the launch of this book, an audiobook. So this may not be immediately what you are thinking about, but is there a next book in the works, in your mind at least?
No, I'm just not that way. I mean, I have written, this is the 7th book, but I've also been an author for 33 years. So the last book I wrote and published was 19 years ago. So I'm not, like a prolific writer. And, a lot of that is I made a choice to have a family. I made a choice to raise children. I've chosen other things besides just writing. And I've I've dedicated most of my career to facilitating other people's writing, and that makes it challenging to do my own. I do think if I write something else, it's going to be really different than this. I think I don't like to say exhausted this topic, but I think I'm finished.
Yeah.
Writing about these particular themes, I could surprise myself, but I think it would be something really different. I have a couple students who wrote memoirs and then went through like a long fallow period, and now they're writing fiction. And I have never written fiction, but they are having a lot of fun. And so I look at them and I think that looks like fun. But I really don't know. I hope to write more because it felt so amazing to be deeply immersed in a book. And it felt incredible at this stage in my career to still be learning so much about my own craft. And I would love to keep learning because, writing is one of those things like meditation or yoga or being a musician where you could just keep improving your entire life, until you're too infirm to do it anymore. And that's something I really love about writing is, there's always going to be someone who's better than you. And I'm not saying this as just a competitive thing, but I mean, there's always something to aspire to in improving your craft. And I would love to do that again. I'd love to. Right now I'm on such an outward push because I want people to read this book. And, when I was young, I had such a successful first book kind of out of the blue. I know what it's like when your book has its own momentum and moves out into the world and has a life that has nothing to do with you. I mean, it has to do with you because you created it. And so having had that experience, it's hard not to want that experience again. And I do value this story. And I think especially now when there are so many families struggling with so many rifts, and there's so much people not speaking to each other and not talking to each other and hating each other's point of view and position. I hope that people can gain something from this about maybe not the how-tos, but the motivation and just the sense that it's possible and that there are ways around some of these obstacles that seem like they can never be moved. And, I think one of the messages in the book is something a really good friend of mine said to me many years ago when I was still really estranged from my mother. So this was a long time ago. And she said, Laura, being right is the loneliest place in the world.
Yeah.
And I just have never forgotten that. I have never forgotten that. And, so she said that to me and I've taken that on as something that I was going to try to repair in my own heart and spirit to be more capable of love, more capable of forgiveness, and not to be so attached to who's right and who's wrong. I think when I think about my mother now, it's like I can look at her and, there's this whole thing about it takes 7 generations to heal systemic trauma, like the trauma of slavery or the trauma of the Holocaust. And so I think about that and I think like it's not just this one woman, the mother, and one woman, the daughter. It's this much bigger system that is so much bigger than both of us. And, not everybody, but many people, they really do their best or they do what they're capable of. And I think it takes a lot of maturity to get to the point of actually seeing that. And it's not true in every instance. There are some really, truly despicable people, who there is not an ounce of kindness or goodness in them. And there's a lot of cruelty, for instance. But I'm not talking about the extremes. I'm talking about, all of us who settle in the middle.
I would love it if you would let our listeners know where to learn more about the books that you've published and, and your work, the courses that you offer and all of that. Could you direct us to a website?
Sure. Yes. If you go to my website, which is www.lauradavis.net, you can get on my mailing list. I've actually been doing a blog recently about the making of the memoir, the making of the audiobook. And I also have a book up there that I give away when you subscribe, which is a writing practice about courage. And you don't have to be a writer to do it, but it's 30 prompts to help inspire courage in people's lives. It's beautifully made, beautifully laid out. And if you go to lauradavis.net and subscribe, you'll get that in your inbox. And it's full of lots of inspiring quotes and statements and poems that I think will give anybody courage. We all need it right now.
Yes, indeed we do. Well, Laura, I want to thank you again so much. Laura Davis, the author of The Burning Light of Two Stars and several other books. Thank you so much for being with me today.
Oh, you're welcome, Becky. I enjoyed it.
Thanks for joining us for Audiobook Connection, behind the scenes with the creative teams. Please take a moment to subscribe at audiobookconnection.com. The podcast is sponsored by Pro Audio Voices, helping great stories come alive through audiobook production and marketing. Learn more at proaudiovoices.com. Again, thanks for being with us, and please join us next week.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.